Hello, and welcome to Snide's Return, a tabletop roleplay podcast. My guest today is a progenitor of a world known and loved by so many in the TTRPG community. His creation has brought so many together for gaming that he has a studio named after that very principle. When he's not helping to forge a path through the moorlands of DM analysis paralysis, he can be found bringing a different adventure zone to the table. Having had some incredible talent bring more of this world to life, it's not surprising that his name is known from the Shadow Marches all the way to the Morar Holds and everywhere in between. So grab your light rail ticket to Shan, and it's an absolute pleasure to welcome Eberron creator, blogger, world builder, and game designer, Mr. Keith Baker. Keith, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. Before we get into some of the things I alluded to there in the introduction, would you mind letting us know how you got into tabletop role-playing games, please?
So I got into tabletop role-playing games when I was around 8 or 9, and my parents gave me a copy of the white box for D&D and the hardcover AD&D books. And at the time, I was a little too young, and none of my other friends had ever heard of any of this. And so it was some years before I actually started to play, but I loved like the monster manual. Like the monster manual is just this book full of monsters with descriptions, and it was just a wonderful thing. I think I have my old AD&D monster manual that I hand colored in some of the beautiful pictures, which I'm not necessarily. I'm not an artist, but so it was around probably fifth grade that I actually started running games for people. And going forward, it all went from there. I would say about 95% of the time I ended up being the DM because I love making stories. And probably late high school was when I basically realized this is a job. Someone wrote these books that I am holding. Like that is a job people do, and that's what I want to do. Now, I'm old enough that back then that wasn't really a concept. There was no clear path to get there. You certainly didn't have like game design majors at school or anything like that. So when I got out of college, I ended up in the computer game industry for about 8 years. And it was sort of through that both I started doing sort of freelance open calls, things like that. And I ended up finally deciding to quit my day job and take a stab at writing full time after one of my latest projects was about to be canceled. And that was the year that Wizards of the Coast announced the fantasy setting search that ended up producing Eberron. So it was very, very fortuitous timing for me.
Yeah, absolutely. So, sort of having taken this creative journey, what was it like putting pen to paper and drafting and then creating this world that many of us in who are potentially new to D&D, or at least the fifth edition of the game as it stands at the moment, um, called Eberron? Sort of, what was the first seed, and where did that grow
Well,
from?
the thing that's interesting about it is for anyone who doesn't know the story, in I think it was 2002, Wizards of the Coast basically, did this thing called the Fantasy Setting Search, which was an open call for a new world. And they basically said anyone who wants to send in a one-page description of a world. And the thing about Eberron is that it wasn't a world I'd been using before. It draws on a couple of pieces of various campaigns I've run, but it was just something I'd actually, at the computer game company I've been working on a pulp based MMORPG. So I'd sort of been living in a world where I've been thinking a lot about Raiders of the Lost Ark, about sort of over the top adventure. And Eberron sort of emerged from this combination of, okay, what if you took that mood, plus, of course, things like film noir, which I love. What if you took those moods and put them onto D&D and then combined that with a thing that had always been an interest of mine, which is that, especially in third edition, arcane magic behaves in such a scientific fashion that why doesn't it feel like a science? Why isn't it used like a science and evolve with the world and with cultures? And so Eberron sort of married those two concepts, the idea of this sort of both the noir aspects of shades of gray, things not always being so simple, the pulp aspects of the heroes as over the top adventure, heroes, with the idea of a world sort of shaped by arcane magic. And so the thing about it is that it started literally as a one-page description of me just pitching this idea. And I think the very first top of it was literally I just wrote a paragraph of a story that was like Mickey Redblade was sharpening his dagger when she walked in. She was 3 feet of trouble, the most beautiful halfling he'd ever seen, but he could see it in her eyes. She was in danger. And so part of it was just, I was just like, I haven't thought this all through. As I said, it was one page, but I'm like, but I like this idea.
Yeah.
And when Wizards of the Coast actually came and said, we like this idea too, tell us more, there was a part of me that was just like, wow, really? Okay. And so it went from there to then having to turn that one page into 10 pages and really start thinking like, okay, how does this world actually work? From there, when it went further forward, it was turning 10 pages into 100 pages. And then when they liked that, it was going to Seattle and working with people at Wizards of the Coast and turning that 100 pages into what we now know as the 3.5 Eberron campaign setting. But it was definitely every step of the way, it was this kind of wondrous experience of, as I said, having this core idea, but really building it all in the moment. As I said, there are certain elements that I can absolutely say, well, that was part of the campaign I ran in high school or things like that. But overall, it was about sort of building this world from the ground up, and it was a very exciting experience.
Yeah. So as you built this, and you mentioned there, touching back on the influences you had from games you ran in sort of high school and earlier in your sort of DMing career, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
What piece of the world of Eberron has stayed with you the longest, is closest to your heart in that respect?
So it's very hard because this is definitely one of those who's your favorite child sort of
Very much
questions.
so, yeah.
And one of my basic approaches to world building is with any piece of it, I want to say, how is this cool? How is this going to make a good story? And you'll see that a lot on my blog of people will ask me things like, where do flumps fit into Eberron? And I've never used flumps in Eberron, but to answer that question, I stop and think, why would I want to use flumps in Eberron? Like, what would be the most interesting story I could imagine with a flump? And I try to do that with everything. I try to say with every country, what's going to be cool about running an adventure in Thrain? So each country, each place, has something that I really enjoy about it. If I had to pick one, just as a sort of personal, if I'm running a story tomorrow, where am I going to put it? I would probably actually say the nation of Droam, which
Oh.
is the nation that's been formed by, sort of monsters brought together by the daughters of Sorakel, who are 3 legendary hags. And part of what I like about Droam is that, especially at the time, it really sort of challenged the idea of what monsters are and essentially said if Corvair in general, if the 5 nations are built on the principle of arcane magic is our foundation and our tool, Droam is built on the idea of, okay, but what if the abilities of monsters were our tools?
Hmm.
One of the tiny details is the fact that how they feed a largely carnivorous population and maintain large population centers is by basically using troll sausage that they, trolls regenerate. And so they have essentially, sausage factories that grind up troll. And it's that kind of point of saying, okay, trolls regenerate. You can cut a limb off and they'll grow it back.
Hmm.
Why are we eating them? And of course, that raises questions of, oh, probably it's incredibly poisonous and things like that. And that's what we've said for Droam is, oh, that's the key. The daughters of Sorakel have secret herbs and spices that make it possible to eat troll. But it's exactly that sort of point of, as I said, taking the creatures that we've always just thought of as these are things for adventurers to kill and get loot out of, and thinking, but what kind of society would they create? What are the unique tools that they possess, and what could they do with them? My Patreon game right now, which is tied to a book I'm writing, is set in Threshold, which is on the border of Droem and Brayland. And part of the point of that is, even though it's technically in Brayland, you get a lot of commerce and interaction with Droem. And so it sort of gets a chance to see all of that, even though it is actually a Brayllish town.
Yeah, I was, as you were sort of recounting that. So within, and I highly recommend people to pick. There is a whole bookshelf of books that I would recommend for people to pick up. But clearly, Eberron, Rising from the Last War, takes the elements of Droem, as you've mentioned there, and puts agents into the city of Sharn and across Corvair. And I love the way that that usefulness of the air quotes monstrous races is being turned into trade and craft and used.
And I agree with that completely. That's part of House Tharash, is also that they are sort of acting as brokers for the people of Droem. And so the idea of, you do in cities like Sharn see harpy messengers and ogre laborers, because why wouldn't you? I mean, that is a valuable resource for them. I'll also point out, for people who are interested, at this point, I think they're only available electronically, but my novel, The Queen of Stone, is actually set largely in Droem. And part of it is because that does give me an opportunity to explore some of that flavor of the nation in a way that, you don't get to in just a source book.
Well, I will put a link to that in the description below this podcast. Speaking of links, actually, Keith, where can people go and find you and everything you're associated with, please?
So I'm all over the place. I would say the two main places that you're going to find sort of the work that I do are my website, which is keith-baker.com. And that, mostly at the moment, I'm posting Eberron material, but I do also sometimes have more general, sort of advice articles or things like that. And then professionally, togetherstudios.com, and that's together with a W, together, is my company. And that's where we're producing all of our games and things like that. So those are sort of two places where you can find what I do. I'm also at Hellcow Keith on Twitter. And on most of the other socials, you can find us either as Together Studio or Together Studios. So just, check that out. I think the other Together Studios out there is a Indian wedding photography company. So you'll probably be able to figure out pretty quickly which one of those you're looking at. And yeah, the final thing, I'll just pitch while we're talking about it, is I do have a Patreon. It's just Keith Baker. And first of all, that supports my website and is where I get the topics for the articles I write. People get to ask questions every month. But what I've been doing for the past year now, and I really like, is I'm running a game set in Threshold, my town on the edge of Droem and Brayland. And basically, it's an ongoing story. We're just up to the 14th session. Every month I run a game, but all of the patrons have a chance to play. That basically the characters remain the same. It's using these 12 characters that we've developed as a group, and everybody gets to sort of vote on elements of the story and things like that. But the actual players in the session change each time. So it's been, given that what I really love is creating stories collaboratively, it's been this great experience to work with 4 more people than I could in just a single session. And I'm very happy with sort of how that's turned out. I wasn't at all sure when I started if it would really work with this changing players, but it's actually gone very well. So check that out.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, with over 500 patrons, that's a lot of rotation of players and gaming styles. You mentioned the characters there. are these the characters we've seen consistently across the releases of books on the DM's Guild, available through Drive-Thru RPG and
No.
various other places?
So those characters, if you're speaking of the sort of iconic adventurers that you see in the artwork on all of the KB Presents books, we call them the Badgers. And they do all have stories. We even have some minis that the Hero Forge people made for us of the Badgers. But that's sort of the thing, is they have their own story, and they're definitely adventurers who go across the world. When I started the Patreon, what I actually did was a series of polls to the players saying, okay, we need the muscle. You know, is it going to be the town sheriff? Is it going to be the town blacksmith? Is it going to be a retired sentinel marshal? You know, sort of would give these, here's 5 possible characters, pick 2. Then with each of those, do you think the blacksmith should be a barbarian? Do you think she should be a fighter? You know, and so we sort of built the characters together. And that's part of the neat point of it, is even though at the end of the day I made these characters, the whole community sort of had a voice in shaping them. And so it does mean even when the players are dropping in and out, people know who these characters are. And we put up, I have a campaign website with bios and all sorts of, recaps and things like that. But as I said, it's kind of neat because they're not just my characters. They're the patrons' characters.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned exploring, and we'll move on to exploring in a minute. But no, my train of thought was gone, so we'll go on to that now.
Lightning rail of thought.
Yeah, exactly. And it took a deviation. I looked out of the corner of my eye, and there was an image, and I was like, I'm going there. So we're going there. So you mentioned about exploring the Rider world. And so if someone has, say, picked up one of the Adventures Leads books, or one of the DM's Guild's books, or even Eberron Rising from the Last War, what if they want to expand? What releases do you have to open Eberron out into maybe different planes or different locations of interest?
Well, I mean, the main one for that is Exploring Eberron, which I released a couple of years now. It was the first thing I worked on when Eberron was unlocked for the DM's Guild. And the thing about that is Eberron is the intellectual property of Wizards of the Coast. And for the longest time, it wasn't possible for anyone not part of Wizards, even me, to actually create new Eberron material. And once they unlocked it for the DM's Guild, that was an opportunity for me to basically write about parts of the world that I'd always wanted to write about, but that never made it into any official book. So 2 key examples of that. One is the planes. From the very beginning, Eberron had a unique planar cosmology that wasn't just the Great Wheel. And yet, we had cool ideas about what made this different and interesting, but it was, none of the planes were ever explored in more than a paragraph. And so Exploring Eberron was my first chance to really dig into that and really get into sort of what makes the planes of Eberron different and unique and give people material to work with. So I was very happy with that. Another was the oceans. That in the original design I did of Eberron way back in the day, part of that was that I actually outlined civilizations in the oceans with the idea that if you have merfolk, Lakatha, Swagan, that if you've got creatures in the oceans that are as intelligent, or in many cases more intelligent than humans, they should have nations. They should have, and how do they interact with the surface world? And it's something that's largely ignored because underwater adventures are problematic in lots of ways. And so it only ends up covering one of the oceans. But Exploring Eberron was that chance to take the Thunder Sea, which is the sort of most commonly trafficked by adventurers, and say, well, what is going on under the water and how does that relate to people? So I will certainly say that in terms of my creations, Exploring Eberron is the largest and the deepest. I've done a couple of other, sort of smaller projects on the DM's Guild that you can, delve into that help in different ways. And I'm working right now on 2 different new books for the DM's Guild. But also, of course, part of the nice thing about the DM's Guild is that anybody can create Eberron material. So there's all kinds of things out there. I think there's like 1,000 Eberron products on the DM's Guild. And so there's definitely a lot to check out and to look into.
Yeah, absolutely. With all this material, there's examples of things like Encounters in Shan being one of them that is
Mhm.
a great GM or DM resource. And sort of linking bit, I remember what the point I was going to, or the question I was going to ask, linking back
Mhm.
with all this fantastic material with the source books, the supplements available through the DMs Guild. Your blog mentions your newest blog at this time of recording, Session Zero, and all that sort of
Yes.
stuff.
Mhm.
How have you found? And people, I highly recommend going and reading the blog post itself. But would you mind giving us a précis of how you conduct a Session Zero, just to help new
Mhm.
DMs?
So, I mean, part of it to me is uh, sort of the classic D&D adventure is five strangers meet in a tavern and someone offers them money to go, beat up the bandits or something like that. These people have no connection. Uh, in the traditional sense, what's your character? Well, I'm a dwarf fighter. That is my character.
Hmm.
And that's all fine. If that's, you just want to roll some dice and beat up some orcs, but you can have sort of what is so wonderful about tabletop role playing games is that we can create these stories together and that we can build things that are deeper and larger. And so I like with Session Zero, which is basically just taking a little time before the first actual charge into a dungeon, to bring the players together and to talk about both. The first thing I will always do is to talk to the players about the story. And the way I like to think of it is it's like if you're going to sit down and watch a television series together. I'm not just going to invite you over to a room and put something on the TV. I'm going to say, "Oh, I'm watching this mystery series. Would you like to join me?" Or we're going to watch Game of Thrones. And that's the thing to me is the first step is to make sure the players know what kind of story we're telling and that they're excited about it. That Eberron can cover so much. Is this more like Indiana Jones or is it more like the Maltese Falcon? Is it high adventure or gritty street drama? And is it something very specific? I want you to be newspaper reporters, like being sent into, war zones or something like that.
Mm.
So the first thing is to pitch the story to the players. And the second is to talk about basically what character idea you have and how does it fit into that. Um, you know, Basically, again, if I was casting a movie, if this is a war story, I'm going to say, oh, well, your pacifist character who really wants to get into politics doesn't quite fit with this unless that's exactly what you want and you
Mm.
really want to be like, oh, I'm fighting against type constantly, well, okay, but let's make sure we all know that's what that story is going to be.
Okay.
And the main thing to me is getting everybody to come with their basic idea and then just to ask questions. So for me, one of like the most basic ones with Eberron is that the last war only ended 2 years ago, and the question is, what did you do during the war? Did you fight? If you fought, who'd you fight for? If you didn't fight, why didn't you fight? If you are, for example, a fighter, why weren't you fighting in the war and what were you doing instead? And basically, that just gets from that point of instead of saying, I am a fighter, it stops and says, why are you a fighter? What have you done with those skills? Where did they come from? So, getting just that little piece can usually spray out a sort of, a lot of different ideas people can play with. And then from that, one of the other biggest questions is, what do you want? If you're an adventurer, why are you an adventurer? Is it because you just have nothing, literally nothing else to do? One of the common pitches I give if people don't have a clear idea is to say, I like to call it the Firefly story. It's saying you are a group of people who fought for the nation of Seir during the war, and it's blown up, and
Mm.
like you all know each other. You all have sort of fought together. You know one another's skills, but you have no home. You have nowhere to go. What are you going to do? And so, as I said, looking to Firefly as an example, it says here's people with a common background, with something that brings them together, and with a very specific set of skills.
Yeah.
Makes sense for them to become adventurers. But it's always that question of, but do you want something? Like if you're getting treasure, what do you want to do with it? Do you want to have a castle? Do you want to get into politics? Where are you in 10 years? And as I said, just those couple of questions. What do you want? What did you do during the war? Are you religious? If so, which? Where are you from? Just a few questions like that can really end up giving people a lot of sort of depth to their character.
Yeah.
The last thing I'll say on that, which I also say in the article, is also at the same time, don't feel you have to answer every question. Don't feel you need to know everything. You don't need an encyclopedia about each character at the start of the game, because you can add it as we go. If you think of a movie, they're going to give us enough with the main character where we feel like we got the basic idea of who this guy is, but then halfway through the movie, we're going to have a flashback about how he lost his brother in, whatever. And you can
Mm.
do that too. You can always, I mentioned in the article, if we establish that you fought for Brayland, in the third session, I can have a guy show up and say, "Oh, he's a Brelish veteran. You served with him in the war. What happened? Like,
Mm.
what do you remember about this guy?"
Yeah.
And let the player establish that connection. So yeah, that's a whole lot of stuff.
No, yeah, I love it, and I love the Firefly reference too. Just making sure I put that out there.
Mhm.
Lots of useful information for session zero and DMs and GMs, to be fair. So thank you for that. Changing it from sort of running the game, DMing the game, to creating the game, you've had so many amazing writers come and work and build on the property that you sort of established. What's it been like opening the world up? And I realize you mentioned it's an IP now of Wizards of the Coast, but it being opened up and having these new hands come in and craft parts of the world.
Well, I mean, the thing about it is that's always been the case in the sense of it's always been property of Wizards of the Coast, and even when I first created it, as I said, it went 1 page, it went 10 pages, it went 100 pages, and then I went to Seattle and worked with uh, James Wyatt, Bill Slavacek, Chris Perkins.
Mm.
And a big part of that was we spent about a week where we just sort of went over everything and essentially said, how can we make this even cooler? And like one of the key ones I always bring up is halflings riding dinosaurs. I had the Talenta Plains as nomadic halflings
Mm.
in a nomadic halfling culture in the original one, but I think they were just riding drybacks or horses or something, and we were sitting around that room just saying, what could be even cooler? And we all argue over who it actually was who said the idea. I think it was James Wyatt, said, well, what about dinosaurs? And we were all like, yes, dinosaurs, halfling on a raptor, yes. uh, and so that's the point to me, is that from the beginning, Eberron was never just mine, and various different writers wrote on, there's quite a few source books that I wasn't involved in at all. And what I have always said is that I want canon to be something that players see as a starting point, as a source of inspiration, not as a something that closes off stories. I always tell people that the important thing is to figure out what the answer is in your Eberron. The
Mm.
biggest example of this is the morning in Eberron. What ended the great last war was the destruction of the nation of Seir by a magical cataclysm called the Morning, and it is a mystery within the world what caused that. And over 20 years, we have never given the answer for what was the cause of the morning, because we don't want to. We want
Mm.
you to decide what the cause of the morning was. We've given lots of possibilities, but the point is, when I play, I could play an Eberron campaign with you, and I know I don't know the answer to the morning because I don't know what you've decided.
Yeah.
So to me, all along, that's just been an important part of the world, is make it your own. It gives us a common foundation to work with, but make it your own. And so I'm very excited to see so many other people out there doing just that. There are certainly lots of things that I look at and I say, well, I'm not going to use that in my Eberron, but I'm glad that someone is and that someone has the opportunity to.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, focusing on something that is yours, Together Studios.
Mhm.
You put out a couple of games already, Illimat, and you've got the Adventure Zone sort of board games coming through. How did that sort of become established, and where's that sort of leading us to in the future?
So that became established actually for the reasons that we've just talked about, which is that Wizards of the Coast owns Eberron. And for until quite recently, I couldn't write Eberron material. And so things like Exploring Eberron, 5 years ago, I couldn't write Exploring
Mm.
Eberron. And so part of it was the first thing we did with Together Studios is a role playing game called Phoenix Dawn Command. And that originally started because I actually started making a new setting because I couldn't, work on Eberron. And then a friend of mine who I was working with, Dan Garrison, said, well, what if you had a game in which death was how your character leveled up? And I said, that's interesting. And that ended up becoming Phoenix. Like originally I was just creating a setting that would probably have been a D&D setting.
Mm.
But basically I found this idea so intriguing that we ended up making an entirely new both setting and system, Phoenix Dawn Command, and Together Studios sort of formed around that. Like, okay, we're going to make this, and then continue to make other games. It's also the case that I have always had an interest in many different types of games. The same year I released Eberron, or Eberron came out, I also made the card game Gloom with Atlas Games.
Mm.
And so, really, Together Studios is a company that the main uniting thing is it's things that my wife Jen and I make together. And we love storytelling, all sort of different types of storytelling, whether it's a game like Gloom, or in this case, the Adventure Zone, whether it's tabletop role playing, or in the case of Illimat. Illimat is a game we made with some friends. The Decemberists sort of came to us and said, we've got this weird thing. Could you make a game out of it? And what we like with Illimat is even though it's in no way a storytelling game, it's a game that feels like it has a story.
Mm.
Like we wanted to make a game that felt like this could have been around for 100 years and you've just forgotten it, or just never run into it.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of what Together is about. Is it's games that we think are interesting. It's games that encourage people to tell stories. And then we have KB Presents as our sort of little, sort of imprint of Together Studios that specifically works on Eberron material for the DMs Guild.
That's sort of having these outflows, these output streams. Clearly seems that I can see it. People can probably hear the excitement and enjoyment you sort of derive from these projects. What's the next big one that's coming to the table for Together Studios and KB Presents?
So KB Presents, we have two things in the sort of mill. The next one that's going to come out is a thing we're calling Chronicle right now. And what that is something we sort of put together because I was in a place where I didn't have as much time as I'd liked, and it essentially takes my favorite articles from my blog,
Mm.
including actually one of them is going to be the Session Zero article, just because it's a useful thing.
Mm.
And it's basically taking my favorite articles from the blog, expanding and editing and cleaning, revising them, also adding mechanics. Because part of the thing of the blog, back when I started it, I couldn't actually do Eberron mechanics. That was sort of part of the whole thing.
Mm.
And so it's taking some of the articles and actually adding mechanical elements to them that they don't have. And so basically, Chronicle is this sort of collection of my 30 sort of favorite things that I've written, expanded and brought together, and a few new things, added as well. But the bigger book is Frontiers of Eberron Threshold, which I started at this point almost 2 years ago. And
Mm.
basically, we thought it was going to be out last year, but there were some real life issues that I had to deal with that made that impossible. And so I have that about half finished, and it's just waiting for me to complete Chronicle to go back and finish that. So we hope Chronicle will be out probably third quarter this year, and Frontiers of Eberron probably early second quarter next year. Frontiers deals with the frontier between Droem and Brayland, and
Mm.
part of the thing about it is so many Eberron books focus on a big picture, Corvair, the plains, that this is taking a relatively small region and going a lot deeper into it. And it's essentially, as with what I'm doing on Patreon, you could run a whole campaign there. We're
Mm.
going into that level of depth, or it's just an interesting place to pass through as you are, going on other adventures. And it's just nice, as I said, to go that little bit deeper into a region. It also draws on a lot of sort of classic Western vibes, with the sort of frontier element, except that, of course, we've got wand slingers instead of gunslingers and
Mm.
all of that.
So, with these projects in mind, I'm going to ask you a slightly personal but also professional question. What is your creative process? How do you go from putting the idea in your mind down to, say, the printed paper? What are your steps for sort of moving through the process?
I mean, it's always the hardest part of any big project. The first 5,000 words are always the hardest part, because it is that question of where do you begin. uh, are you hitting a particular tone? And once you get a certain amount of momentum, it just rolls along. But the initial part is always very difficult. And one of the biggest things to me is always just that question of how will this come into a story. Like, if I'm working on whether somebody asks me where flumps go into, whether I'm
Mm.
starting with Frontiers of Eberron, whether it's a big thing or a little thing, it's always saying, what are people going to do here? What's a cool story that could happen here? And how do I describe that? It's one reason a lot of the things I work on actually start, like the chapter will start with like a little paragraph of a story. And part of that is because that is me sort of saying, what's a story that's going to happen here? And then using that to sort of jumpstart, writing about it.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's really helpful because I've attempted to write bits and pieces for other bits and pieces, and definitely building that momentum has certainly been foiled a couple of times. So no, I appreciate that sort of insight. Sorry, please.
And one of the things I would definitely add to that is also, don't try to get those first 5,000 words perfect. Part of the point is that you're going to have that voice in your head saying, oh, no, it's not right. Oh, it's not good enough. And the point is, just keep pushing forward to make something. And you'll have time to go back and make it perfect. In part, it's as you get the momentum. When I'm writing a big book like Frontiers, when I just sit down, I don't necessarily know what it's going to be. By the time I'm 10,000 words into it, oh, okay, it's going to be more on this area than I thought it was going to be initially, and I'll figure that out. And as I
Mm.
said, I'll probably go back and rewrite that first 10,000 words. But you've got to get that momentum, going, just to sort of figure it out, what you're doing.
Yeah, for sure. And so, sort of mention building this momentum with you working on KP Presents, Together Studios, and various other projects. Do you get downtime? Do you get time for? Have you sort of sussed out this work-life balance thing everybody's trying to sort of make the best of?
I mean, it's an advantage. It's one of those things of, well, it helps if your job is your hobby. So the point to me is, oh, when I'm not working on stuff, that's when I'm answering questions for people on my Patreon, or working on the adventure I'm going to run, for the Patreon.
Mm.
Uh, I am working on so many different things like right now. So I told you we've got those two books.
Mm.
Every month I'm doing things for my Patreon. We have 4 different board and card games in development for Together Studios right now. The ones that I think we have talked about are that we're doing an expansion for Illimat and an expansion for the Adventure Zone, and those
Mhm.
are pretty much done at this point. But still, a lot of things going on, and I'm actually consulting for a video game company. So I am just stupidly busy all the time. And the work life balance is something I do still need to figure out. But again, part of it is, like I said, I really like what I do. The main challenge is that it is difficult finding the creative, building that momentum when you're then changing momentum.
Mm.
One of the things I found is a lot of times people will ask me to do a little something for a Kickstarter. Oh, can you write a monster for my book? And I always want to, because sure, why not? It's a small thing. It's only 1,000 words, and yet what I always find is, okay, but I've got to get my brain around this setting or world or whatever to really figure out how to make something good for it, and that can end
Mm.
up actually taking a lot more time than just the 1,000 words would be. So it is something I have to be careful with.
Yeah, no, I can only imagine. Only imagine. So we've mentioned there about board games, card games, and things like that, and downtime and things like that. Are there games out there? It could be TTRPG systems or
Mhm,
just board games in general that you're like, if I've got the time, I would love to just have a
mhm.
session of or a game of that.
I think probably the biggest one of that. I mean, I do play games and such. I had for a long time. We're just right now. I've been in a game with a couple of the Decemberists, a few other musicians and artists. That was a weekly D&D game for most of the pandemic. That I was playing it.
Mm.
As I said, most of my life I've been the DM, but I'm just a player in this. And actually, for the last probably 4 or 5 months, we actually switched over and we've been playing Tales from the Loop. So that's
Okay.
been a twist. Um, I would love to play more Savage Worlds just
Mm.
because I am constantly hearing good things about it. I've only played it once, and I just like to have a better feel for it. It just seems like an interesting system that a lot of people I know love. So that's certainly one on my list of, oh, I'd like to play more of that sometime when I have the time.
Yeah, no, there are a lot of great systems out there, and certainly Savage Worlds is one that I'd like to dig into more at some stage, along with the 30 others I've got lined up on the shelf, as I'm sure you probably have as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. I have to say, I wrote my earliest published role playing material was for the game Over the Edge, which came out in the 90s. And I love that system and that setting. And I've had on the back of my mind, I'm trying to convince the people in my Tales from the Loop campaign to sort of push the story forward 10 years and have me run a over the edge game for those characters. But we'll see if that happens.
Well, good luck with that. Just as we start to get towards the tail end of this interview, take a brief moment. So, if you wouldn't mind reminding everybody where they can find yourself and everything you're
Oh,
associated
sure.
with, that'd be great.
So my blog is at keith-baker.com, Keith-Baker. And that's where you'll find a lot of Eberron material. My Patreon, I'm Keith Baker, and that's where you can ask the questions that become articles on the blogs. And Together Studios, that's TWO, is where you can find Phoenix, Illimat, the Adventure Zone, all of those other things. And on socials, most everywhere, it's either Together Studio or Together Studios. And you can also find me as Hellcow Keith on Twitter.
All right. Well, as I said at the start, I'll make sure those links are in the description below, along with the link to The Queen of Stone, your novel.
Oh, thank you.
So, having discussed a lot of topics, both Eberron as a setting, game playing, game running, game design, and creation, is there any sort of final thought or advice you would give out to new DMs, players, or content creators?
Mhm. One of the ones I would give for game masters, most of all, is ask questions. And this is, at least to me, part of what I love most. I've worked on video games, I've written novels, I've done all this. And part of what I love most about tabletop role playing games is that it is collaborative. I have an adventure that I've run 60 times. and it has never gone exactly the same way twice, because in part that's how I designed it, but in part it's because it has that room for players to make interesting decisions. And so that every time I run it, it's like getting to watch a favorite TV show, but things turn out differently. And for me, again, the main point is take advantage of that. If you're going into a haunted temple, give a couple details. There's this altar, there's a statue over it where half the face is broken off. But I like to then ask a player, okay, and there's something really creepy here. What is it? Or if you run into a mob of zombies, I'll say they're definitely people from this village. You see the butcher and he's missing an arm. Bob, tell me about a zombie that catches your eye, and get each player to sort of describe one of the creatures. In part,